We'll dissect what has happened to truth and then define it with author Josiah O'Neill on this episode of United Patriots Uprising with Gary Bintry. I'm your host, Gary Bintry. Thanks for joining us. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. The video version is available at YouTube, Rumble, and Conservative Television of America. In either case, hope you'll click that subscribe button. It helps people find the show. Also, if you like the show, give us a like click. And also, I'd love it if you'd leave a comment so we'd understand what you want to hear and how you feel about some of these issues. You know, these wokesters, they want us to believe that truth is relative. You hear things like, well, that's your truth, but that's not my truth. Or that's my truth, and that doesn't have to be your truth. Well, you know, we have to get back to truth, people, because without it, we're about to lose this country. So you want to get back to defining truth? Well, let's get into it. He was raised in Mexico and Ecuador. He's been a soldier, been a police officer, ran for Congress. Right now, he has a private security consulting firm that does all kind of work of protecting churches and other entities. He also has a nonprofit that's called Defining Truth, and he's the author of a book called Defining Truth. I welcome to the show a man who is positively going to set the blaze, the airwaves, Mr. Josiah O'Neill. Josiah, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. And my brother in Christ, I love what you do and your background and your story. And you know, God bless you, what you do and your service to our nation, because we need warriors and we need those 1%ers who are willing to put it all on the line. And you have done that. And my question to you is how and why? Why have you become a purveyor of truth when so many people have turned away from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also at the core, the inception of what we currently do. So you mentioned I bounced around quite a bit, served in different areas of the government. I was in public service for about 20 years. And I think during that time and pondering the question of how do I use these talents and experiences to the benefit of God's kingdom, I noticed this large disconnect between the political and ideological narrative that's pervasive in the United States now, between that and the reality that I was observing on the ground in these government positions. You mentioned I worked in local law enforcement, but I also served at the federal level and in the military. So from the geopolitical sort of global events perspective, I saw a lot of manipulation and reframing of cultural movements to benefit the left's movement in this country. And I was upset for two reasons. One, because I'm a patriot and I love my country. And two, because as a Christian, I didn't like that we had allowed our enemies to define who we are. We've allowed our opposition to frame the argument. They've chosen the terms, and by and large, the church in America has agreed to them. And we have paid dearly for that. So now, whether in business or in our nonprofit work, our goal is to define truth clearly, to inform people, to equip people so that they can make informed biblical decisions about their worldview and what's going on around them.
Absolutely. Now, what I found interesting about your story and part of your background, growing up in Mexico and Ecuador, when you got here and you saw what was going on, and you saw what the left was doing, and you saw the direction that they were trying to take us into a Marxist, socialist, communist direction, you're like, oh, heck no. I started to say hell no, but I'll say, oh, heck no, hell no. And the bottom line was, why was it that bothered you, yet it's not bothering as many Americans as it should?
Well, there's a lot of deception going on today. You know, one of the benefits, I would say, of being raised outside the country, but with parents who put a high emphasis on history and love for country, is that I was sort of impervious to a lot of the propaganda the left had accomplished in the United States during those years of me growing up. You know, I was raised to understand that, of course, there are evils throughout a country's history and bad things and good things, but I was really raised to understand that America was the most benevolent nation to have ever blessed the earth. All of the good that we've done, and it wasn't because of man's effort. It was solely and squarely because this nation predicated everything about the government on a biblical worldview. The founders made this extremely clear, and really all of U.S. history is wrought with evidence of Christian Judaic values influencing the nation for good. And as the nation sort of surrendered our structure to God and His way of doing things, we were greatly blessed. And you could read this because history is there for everyone to see. So, in seeing that, and then looking at what the progressive left had accomplished by reframing and essentially, just call it what it is, they lied to people. They lie about our history. They lie about the founding fathers. They take instances of evil. You know, we talk about slavery, which is a common topic to come up in historical sort of overviews. And the left, let's just put it this way: the left, they are masters at taking an incident and expanding it to represent a pandemic. So we see this not only in history, but we saw it in law enforcement with isolated incidents. We see it in geopolitical events around the world. When the truth is that the United States, in contrast to a lot of other countries that were coming up at the same time, experienced tremendous growth, wealth, and probably most notably, liberty, like the world had never known for its individual citizens. De Tocqueville, when he came to visit the United States early on, was absolutely shocked to see that everywhere he went, whether it was in the big city of New York or the Appalachian Mountains, that every American he encountered had at least a third grade reading level. They were literate. And you know what they were reading? The Bible. They were reading a foundation for which the founders believed if we premise it on this, everything else will follow. You know, if you take by comparison what the French were doing, because de Tocqueville was coming from there, you know, the French went through this leftist revolution that led to the murder of hundreds of thousands of people. Actually, more. It's estimated that somewhere between 600,000 and 1.3 million French died during the French Revolution period, where we were kind of at odds with them. We didn't know if that was going to overflow and affect us as well. But interestingly enough, here in the United States, there was guys like Charles G. Finney, who believed that the gospel and the Bible wasn't just for man's soul, but it was useful as a means for cleaning up society itself. And during that time, you look at the Second Great Awakening, Christians became the leaders in many social concerns, education, prison reform, women's rights. It was unbelievable the good that we accomplished, that God accomplished and blessed this nation with. And now the left is lying about that and attempting to do the same thing that they've tried all around the world. And we will, of course, suffer the same outcome, which is death and destruction.
You know, what you're talking about is cultural Marxism at its ungodly, evil worst. You know, how they, like, if Karl Marx, if they couldn't get him to overthrow the nation by revolution, so now we'll change the language, we'll pit black against white, male against female, rich against poor, create all this chaos, and then come in and say we have to take over with big government. How do they pull this off to the point that they are? And did you see this coming? In other words, during your time in the military, your time in the police, and even now as your own private security consulting, did you just see this? Was it a slow matriculation, or did it just suddenly just go boom?
No, it's been a long road, really, since the 1960s, which is a whole other conversation in of itself. But I think the greatest catalyst is that lies and allowed to spread, if they go unchallenged, will continue to grow. And so in my sort of analysis of the situation, because at some point I had to take a step back and say, how in the world did we get here?
Right.
Well, if you take a step back and look at, the church was the predominant cultural influence in this country for many years. It was the moral guideline. Even our founders said that this republic was not useful for anything other than a moral and religious people. We held on to that truth for many, many years. The left was very smart in how they attacked that aspect. they framed the argument to say that the real things that matter in life were political, and so the church needed to stay out of it. And for whatever reason, the church accepted the enemy's framing of the situation and they took a step back. So, you know, we're not alone in recognizing this either. I think it was Winston Churchill I wrote about in my book who summarized it best in that Western civilization was inextricable from Christian Judaic values. He mentioned during, Britain's greatest struggle, and I'll read this quote here from Churchill. He said, "I expect that the Battle of Britain," and he's referring to World War II against the Nazis, "the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization." See, Churchill understood that if secular humanist mentality of the Nazis were to prevail, then the world would enter this globally dark period, the likes of which had never been seen before. And so we are dealing with the exact same thing. Secular humanism is the god of the age. And the world has successfully convinced the church to get out of their way because these issues don't belong to them. And we have paid the price for it. I mean, it's really as simple as that.
Hear you. Now, Pastor Jack Hibbs, who I love and who my best friend, because I live here in New York, and my best friend, right, he said, "Gary," because my show is all about unveiling the communist Marxists, take over the United States. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, I got born again in 1997. And it's ever since then, I left the Democratic plantation, and it's all been about God's kingdom here as well as on heaven. And I understood right away that everything is political, that God has an opinion on everything. And it's in the Bible. It's not hard. It's not rocket science. And the reason my friend Kenny Harmon told me you have to listen to Pastor Jack Hibbs is because at this time, and this is going back a few years ago, Pastor Hibbs was one of the few people that was very political in his approach and not shying away from the issues because God has an opinion and stands on each issue. And that's where I came to love him. And I know you have an association with him. And why do you think very few pastors really took up this mantle to understand if we don't take this fight up as believers, because we're the only people that have the truth. We carry the truth of Christ. All truth comes from God. Okay. And we're the only ones that have it. So if we get silenced, it's gone and we're going to lose this country. Why do you think so many pastors were afraid to take this mantle up? And I'm going to ask you a question because, as you know, Jesus spoke about if you love the world, the love of your father, the love of the Father is not in you. Do you think some people thought, well, if we become political, that's the world and we shouldn't be part of the world? Well, look, if you don't do it, we're going to be like China, an underground church.
You're spot on, right? So when we talk about we've accepted the enemy's framing, that's exactly what I'm describing. So these issues are not political. They're God's issues. Mm-hmm. And for many, many years, the opposition has gotten away with that because churches essentially have sat down and shut up. They've refused to engage, or far worse, they've accepted the cultural influence to where the gospel's no longer affecting the culture is affecting the gospel and the liturgy of these churches. And again, I keep saying, we've paid the price for this. We've paid a price probably far higher than people even realize. We see this in the trans hysteria with our children. We see it in even in the economy and how foolish, unwise leaders are bringing down a great society. Now, you talk about Jack. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are afraid to do what he does, perfect example, I'm sure you've seen recently his prayer in Congress and how he immediately came under assault. And once again, the left is trying to frame the narrative. They're throwing out this term Christian nationalist. I was just talking with my co-host here on our podcast, Brandon, before the show started about this new reframing and how when the left has now seen that there are pastors like Jack and others who are standing up to address cultural warfare. And so now they're like, okay, now we need a new label. Let's call them Christian nationalists, and we'll define that term however we see fit. So yeah, to your point, I think that a lot of people are afraid of the cost, but any believer who's been in his word, a decent amount of time is going to know that there is a cost to standing for truth, especially when you're speaking about the person and deity of Jesus. That's really the issue. If you notice in his congressional prayer, many other pastors, clergy, quote unquote, religious people have gone to pray before Congress. That really wasn't the issue. The Democrats were mad because he invoked the name of Jesus. And right off in the first sentence of the prayer, he said the word Father, which was apparently offensive to the left. These people are dark.
Love it.
They're evil. And I think that the outrage that Jack has received from a lot of his outspokenness is proof that if churches stood up and confronted what's going on in this country, the ramifications would be massive. And I think the left knows that, or I should say the demons behind the eyes know that on the left. They know that this battle is not of flesh and blood. It's a spiritual battle. And the pastors of all people should be acknowledging this. I often, when I get a chance to speak at venues, I recall the story of Jehoshaphat. Just a quick recap. Israel was under threat from just a massive external source. They were coming to kill them. And it's a long story, but here's the point. Jehoshaphat, when he sought the Lord, was told that God would deliver them. And as they marched into battle, they didn't put strategy first. They didn't put the soldiers first. They sent the worshipers and the singers out in front of the army to go before them as they declared their victory was already won. The point is, Jehoshaphat, though he was dealing with a political situation, he knew that putting the worship and acknowledgement of God first was what he needed to do. And of course, if you read there in the story in 2 Chronicles, let me just read you the one verse from chapter 20 in verse 16. This is what the Lord says to him about this impending terrible situation. God said to Jehoshaphat, tomorrow go down against them. They're going to come up by this ascent of Ziz. You'll find them at the end of the valley east of the wilderness of Jeruel. In verse 17, he says this, you will not need to fight in this battle. Okay. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. That's what Jack is really talking about when he goes to Congress and he prays. That's what we're all about at Defining Truth. We're trying to remind the greatest influencers in this country, the church, that, as you said, we are the keepers of light, the holders of truth. And so to hide that and to be defined by our enemies is wrong. It's a travesty, and we're paying the price for it.
I hear you. Josiah, the thing that always gets to me, like I do this show, and this show comes on strong. I bring on a lot of, I've been blessed to have more than 150 high-profile guests that speak truth like you. And I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't believe I had God's protection. And I'm only going to have God's protection if I do it his way. I really believe pastors are being sifted, and the true pastors of Christ, the blood-bought true pastors will stand for God, will stand for truth, because that's where God's protection is. It's just like what you said with Jehoshaphat. It's like what with Jehoshaphat. It's like what happened with Gideon. It's like what happened with Moses in the Red Sea. God will fight the battle for us, but we have to be on his side. He's not going to be on our side. We have to align with him. And I really think we're finding out who the real pastors are, because the ones that aren't aligning with him, I think they're being sifted into showing who they really are, because it's now or never to stand up for this country, as far as I see it.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's as simple as starting with clarifying what truth is. I mean, this whole attack against churches being involved in culture is a big sign of how effective they really could be. If Christians were to get back involved, and I say back because once upon a time they were deeply involved in our country. This is how we got rid of things like slavery. It was Christian abolitionists and the ideals taught in the Christian Judaic worldview that said this is wrong. I was utterly impressed as I was doing research in my book. I quoted the vice president of the Confederacy at the time in his long letter that he wrote to to Jefferson Davis about the issue of slavery. And I was utterly shocked. what he said about the founders and how they abhorred slavery. He said it was an evil that they knew not well how to deal with. He basically, and it's much longer, I encourage anyone to go read the book. He basically said, look, these guys believed in a biblical worldview, and it's messing with our goals here of slavery. They didn't know how to deal with it because the Bible told them it was wrong. We follow that throughout history quite a bit. America didn't start slavery. It was a worldwide phenomenon. But what we did do is end it sooner than any other empire to have ever existed. Those movements and many others were driven by the fuel of Christian Judaic values. So I think in today's culture war, we have to get back to a lot of the false premise that the left is operating on that they just take for granted because the church has wholeheartedly swallowed these lies, and a lot of unknowing, I guess just generally ignorant public is just like, oh, well, separation of church and state as defined by the progressive Marxists. I guess it is what it is. So we can't do anything. No, you got to remember things like John Adams. Let me read this quote from John Adams. I would read this to the Democrats who were enraged that Pastor Jack read a prayer. We should send them some quotes from the founding fathers. John Adams
and
said,
they used to start the congressional session in prayer back then.
And very specifically, to counter their lie, they were praying to Jesus. This was a Christian nation in as much as the founders believed that compared to every other failed government system around the world, if they based this one on the Bible, it would succeed. And they were very careful about framing that. You read the Constitutional Convention, it's all recorded for people to read. You'll hear them debate back and forth, and you'll constantly hear them refer to, hey guys, if we go down this road like the human secularist, we're going to fail like everybody else has. That point, John Adams said that listen to this quote. This is John Adams speaking about this topic and the biblical view in government. He said, I do also recommend these acts of humiliation, penitence, and prayer, and fervent thanksgiving to the author of all good be united for the countless favors which he's talking about God of the Bible, is still continuing to the people of the United States, which render their condition as a nation eminently happy when compared with the lot of others. So they had a very sober perspective in that the reason America was blessed and growing so quickly was because they surrendered their culture to a biblical worldview. Yeah. And this was everywhere. It's pervasive everywhere. Education, Harvard, Yale, all the original schools required the students to learn Hebrew and Greek so they could read the Bible. They understood that if we departed from that, the type of liberty and freedom that we had in this constitutional republic just wouldn't suffice. It doesn't work with an evil, God-denying people. It's not going to work. The liberty that America enjoys is based on a moral people that believe in a biblical perspective on individual freedom. I mean, I go into detail in the book, but this is where we get every concept that conservatives today defend. I have a whole chapter on self-defense, and we talk about the Second Amendment is emphatically derived from a Christian perspective on the value of life. Yeah. And so this is why we've defended it for so long versus someone like Mao, who said that it all starts with a gun in the hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very sad times we're in.
I agree. Now, what we do on the show, we put a lot of people on the edge of the cliff, holding on the bridge by their fingernails, but we also always like to give them solutions to climb down and realize that this war is still winnable. So in defining truth, what do you say is the solution? What can every individual do, whether you are Christian or whether you're not, if you're a patriot or whether you're not? What can every American do to get back to truth?
Well, fortunately, we have realism on our side, and that makes our fight that much easier. The left, I think, and I'm going to misquote myself, but I wrote something to the effect of it takes a lot of work to convince someone, that they don't exist, lies and propaganda, but it only takes a pinprick to convince them they do. The left has to work really hard to manipulate history, to lie to people. I mean, essentially, secular humanism convinces people that the blue sky is red. It's quite the challenge to dismiss logic and common sense, and we see this everywhere. So really all it takes is us standing up and caring again. I mentioned if the churches would care and get involved and instruct their parishioners in wisdom, we would win every election, local and federal, across this country. We would decimate them. So it starts with caring, number one. Number two, we have to equip people with truth, which is the aim of the book when I wrote it. I wanted to put some weapons and tools back into the right hands and say, look, you don't have to bow down and accept the narrative about virtually anything the left says. They're liars. They lie about everything to accomplish their political goal. Mm-hmm. So one, you care. Two, you need to arm yourself with the knowledge to enter this type of ideological warfare, which begins with caring, right? And three, everybody has their part to play. Not everyone's called to run for Congress or, an elected office, but you can show up to school board meetings. You can have conversations with friends and coworkers and family members. You can vote, which is imperative. You can be part of the solution by disseminating truthful information. Social media, for example, overwhelmingly the greatest source of news intake in the world today. 90+% of media worldwide is digested by or via TikTok. I heard an interesting stat recently that the coverage hours for the October 7th massacres in Israel on all mainstream media groups combined, that's CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and all of them, was about 400 million views. Mm. TikTok was coming in at about 500 million.
That's scary.
So
we know what TikTok is.
A lot of people, absolutely, it's trash. So I think you have to use these platforms. You have Instagram, you have others like Facebook, social media, etc. Not to intake all the garbage, but there are people watching and learning, and so be part of the solution. Spread, the truth and information and counter the narratives. Especially, we have to care about our children. The left is coming for your kids. Make no mistake. They always have. Mao did that. Hitler did that. The Soviets did that. It's well documented. I'm working on a second book right now, and I'm researching a lady named Alexandra Kollontai, who was the first People's Commissar for Welfare in the Soviet Union. And she wrote extensively about the need to separate children from their parents because the outdated notion of marriage and parents would not suffice for what the Soviets called was the new man. So you see that today in America very, very much so in schools, in public schools. And
Josiah, before you go any further, who started that? Who separated the first family that God put together? Satan in the garden, right?
Satan.
Separated Adam and
Absolutely.
Eve and started he's picked us off one by one ever since.
Yeah, Satan's always had a goal of disunity and destroying what God has brought together. That's definitely true throughout history. Not only separation, but since we're bringing up the Garden of Eden, the whole cultural narrative today is that there's no God. So the only thing that matters is the self. It's the exaltation of the deification of the self. And of course, that's an original message too. The serpent told Eve, well, the reason we don't want you to have this knowledge or eat from this tree is because you'll be like God, rendering essentially God's status ineffectual. And that's the same message today. Division, division, division. We see the left wants to divide people by every way possible. Skin color, identity group, gender, class. It's typical Gramscian Marxism.
Josiah, you after many years, several decades in the military and law enforcement, now you're in private security. It's one of the loves of your life. Please tell us about what you do. And, you're kind of protecting one of my favorite people on the planet.
Yeah, we do have quite a unique perspective to what we do with O'Neill Security Group, or OSG as we call it. And we brought all of the experience in protective operations from the U.S. government. And I'm talking running protective operations in very austere environments like the Middle East, et cetera, and domestically. and we've adapted them to a private application. So one of our recent programs is actually moving into schools with a program called the Century Program. This is a very different take. As far as I'm aware, there's really not any other company doing what we're doing. And we've taken the diplomatic security service model of security program management of a site or a facility, say like a mid-sized embassy, and we've applied it to protecting our most valuable asset, our children. And so we do have uniformed guys, and we do guard work. The School Century program by no means is a security guard, though. It's more of a program manager. And what we do is we come into an academic environment understanding that we're there to learn, and we teach people how to run programs just like we did at the highest levels of threat in the United States government and abroad. We teach them how to prevent things from ever happening in the first place. A big difference between, I guess, what people would consider a bodyguard, right? Is sort of just the biggest, baddest guy you can find. They stand around, they look mean, and you hope nothing happens. When in truth, real professional protective security operations, most of the work is done behind closed doors. This is on the protective intelligence side, checking sources, surveillance detection, routines, methods, tactics, training, and procedures. That's where the real professionals are done. Point in case, I worked at the State Department for the service during the time of Mike Pompeo, who had very active threats against him from the Iranians. If you were to see us on the news, you would have seen a bunch of guys in suits walking from one building to a waiting limo and walking away. And to the external, unexperienced or unknowing person, you think, well, that's just a bunch of goons. It's a bunch of security guards. What you're not seeing is months of preparation and work and intelligence and planning, details that you wouldn't even imagine, like the medical details and evacuation routes and nearest level 1 trauma centers, quite in depth to stay alive in a dangerous environment. So we've taken those models, concepts, and lessons learned, no need to reinvent the wheel, and we've said, why can't we apply this to schools and churches? So it's a unique thing that I feel up to this point, God has tremendously blessed us. We do provide security services in a variety of ways to Calvary Chapel Chino Hills, where you mentioned Pastor Jack is. We also have a growing number of schools who have signed contracts with us. And it has been absolutely phenomenal. The relationship between our type of service and the clients or the schools is so much deeper than just posting a security guard out in front of the fence. We aim to be part of the family. We're an integral part of organizational operations. And that's really the difference between your tier 1 government folks and what I guess up till now has been part of the course in the United States.
And I think it's needed because I remember for years after I became a believer that people at work would say, well, what's wrong with the schools? Our kids, it's, getting home from school or even staying alive in school is worse than almost being in the streets. And I said, hey, you voted, God's been kicked out of the schools. So, hey, security, that helps. I'm sorry, Josiah. I know it's time, but I've got to just throw one more question out because my head is just exploding over wokeness. Oh, gosh. Just mic drop. Just go for it.
All right. So that's a broad topic. All right.
Right,
so let me see here.
Any part, how to get rid of, can you believe it's here? What can we do? Just, oh my gosh.
All right. So here's some homework for anybody that might be listening. Okay. When you're attacking the concept of wokeness, it kind of goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, challenging the original framing or definition of the subject. Okay. Aristotle talked about this quite a bit in his work on knowledge and logic and the concept of first principles. Okay. Now that is, when you deal with someone of a woke ideology, before you get into the weeds of all the details, you got to take a step back and ask them some questions. Okay. First, study and prepare yourself to have that type of conversation. But when you're ready, ask them questions that everything else they believe in is premised on, right? They want to talk about the trans agenda and how, kids can be a cat or a donkey if they want, and it doesn't matter. Take it back. Don't talk to them at that level first. Let's go back to where that worldview developed. Where are you getting that concept? Ask them simple questions like, do you believe in God? Okay. If they say no, then say, well, where do you believe that the concept of right and wrong comes from, good or bad? And that could go any one of many directions. If they say they don't believe it, maybe they're a relativist. Well, they just defeated their own argument, because you could say, well, then nothing you're saying is relevant. It doesn't matter. If they try to tell you that there's no such thing as absolute truth, ask them simply, is that true? And so if it's not, then there's no point. The first principle just destroyed their whole belief. So asking questions a lot of times is a great way to start when you're dealing with the woke ideology, because oftentimes when the person who's accepted these woke beliefs sits back and thinks about it, they will actually talk themselves out of it, because logic never works with the woke mentality. It doesn't fit. So you can just rationally approach the situation before you even present your solution. So you can get someone to rationally reach the conclusion that the law of causation, for example, is applicable to philosophy as well as science, meaning nothing came from nothing. There's a cause for everything we see. So if you can sort of navigate the conversation to that first cause, then you can propose, before you propose, well, we know the answer is Jesus and we talk about the Bible. Ask them, what is your cause? What do you propose the source of moral good is? If there's moral laws, there must be a moral law giver. If there's a purpose in life, there must be a purpose giver. And so it gets their wheels spinning, and it oftentimes will self-destruct their own conversation. You see this especially at college campuses, because younger people are prone to just spew all kinds of nonsense they get off TikTok and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. And they've never been challenged because they live in this homogenous culture of anti-American progressive Marxism. Well, when you just ask them some questions, it starts to fall apart. The topic is massive. We could go into how wokeism has invaded every aspect of American culture, but let's just, since you brought it up, if I may, let's talk about why it has invaded the church specifically, because that's something I have a big problem with. Okay.
Same here.
I understand a lot of people were led astray because they weren't prepared for what the progressive Marxists threw at us over the last 10 years. When they came after geopolitical movements in the military, they didn't know what to say. They weren't experts, right? They didn't know how to address waterboarding and counterterrorism. Then they came for the cops. They didn't know how to address it. Most people don't even have interactions with police outside of getting a speeding ticket. And then you have the criminal world that deals with cops more often, et cetera. But a lot of people didn't know how to deal with those issues as they came up. But the church of all people should have seen this coming. They should have been on guard, because here's the big difference between the world and the church. If you have the Holy Spirit indwelling, you should have a thing called discernment.
Amen.
And that's something the world doesn't have. And discernment is the simple ability to divide right from wrong, to rightly see a situation. Sometimes things are harder, and we arrive at that through prayer, through seeking the Lord, through reading his word. But discernment is a very stark difference between the believing American citizen and the non-believing American citizen. Why? Because we know that wisdom only comes from the fear of God. Only from having a right perspective on reality can you, as Aristotle pointed out, have a correct worldview from everything else that follows. If your premise is wrong in the first place, then everything that follows is fruit of the poisonous tree. So you have to start with logic and rationalism and the knowledge of God as creator, and that's where wisdom is derived from, and through his Holy Spirit we have discernment. So to the world, I understand. You got swept over by Marxism. Maybe you weren't a culture war student or into politics. You should be now. Mm-hmm. But to the church, I should have said, you should have recognized that was not the voice of your father. That was the spirit of this world coming to divide, to destroy, to essentially convince you, hey,
everything God told you, it's actually not true. You need to accept our version of love, our definition of caring, this secular humanist approach to dealing with your fellow men. And it's one of the greatest travesties of this century that the church bowed down to this cultural movement of wokeness. And you know how they did it? The left told the church, this is politics. You're not allowed to talk about it. And little by little, they took more and more ground. They told us that taking our children from us in public schools, it's politics. Don't talk about it, Pastor. That marriage, sacred union between a man and a woman, that's politics. Don't talk about it, Pastor. They've advanced this ball so far down the field now, they're near the end zone, and the church is panicking because they're looking back going, what happened? What happened is that we weren't on guard for the enemy. There was a great lack of discernment in the church in America, and we allowed the enemy to infiltrate our liturgy, our message, our preaching, our everything. And here's the ray of hope, like you said. It's never too late because
Amen.
God is so much bigger than all of these people. God can blink and it's done. What he wants us, though, is he's looking for people to worship in spirit and in truth. He wants people to seek him and come before him, as we saw in all throughout Scripture. When we bow, when we seek his face, when we turn to him, he saves. And so the message of hope is that all of the enemy's efforts can be obliterated in the snap of a finger. I really honestly feel that God is waiting for his people to come to him. He's waiting for the church to say, we done messed up. We need you, God. Give us some direction. God can do mighty things in a culture and a nation when we turn to him and admit our inefficiency. See, that is the polar opposite of the message of this world. The message of this world is self-reliance. You do what's good for you. You're the source. You're the reason. That's why it's such a terrible thing in woke ideology to offend someone, right? Even we talk about pronouns. Why? Well, because if you don't believe in God, you're offending their God, themselves. Remember, it was Aleister Crowley, greatly influential in the Satanic Bible, who said that this demon-possessed character showed up to him and his wife on their honeymoon in Egypt. And he said that this spirit, non-corporeal body is how he described it in his own words, told him that it had a name, Awas, and this spirit told him, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. That was the message that this spirit told Aleister Crowley, who then went and was very influential in the secular humanist movement in the 20th century. Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. If that doesn't sum up woke ideology, I don't know what is. And the church, through discernment and the word of God, should have recognized that for what it was. That's a demonic influence. And so they should have scrutinized what those movements were saying. If I know that BLM was trained progressive Marxists, they gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to promote transgender strip shows in elementary schools. As a pastor, if I saw that, and I knew that they were at their core an atheist organization, then I should have carefully scrutinized what it was that they wanted me to believe. Exercise some common sense, folks. But it didn't happen. And so wokeism continues to spread because lies will grow wherever they're not countered. And there's no one that's going to counter the lies of the enemy, if not the church and us as believers. So that's where we stand on wokeism.
That's where you stand, and you know you laid that out very, very well. And I do believe, as you said, God was waiting for the believers because we're his people. He's waiting for us to wake up, and he gave us a taste of what communism looks like. It's like he let the left go, and they've outkicked their coverage. They've ripped off their masks. They think they've won. They're showing us who they are, and a whole bunch of people are aghast now. And now you have people praying and begging God to save our land. As I say, God's going to do his thing, but we have to be ready to take the trash out when he shows us who the trash is. Like, as you know, in the Bible, every time there was a battle, God may fight the battle, but we had to finish. When Goliath went down, they had to go and kill the Philistines. When the walls came down in Jericho, they had to kill everybody in Jericho. The prophets of Baal, Elijah took care of them, but it's always going to be a lot of these times when God levels the playing field. Now his people are going to have to rise up and finish the job, and I hope we're up to it. Frankly, I think if we're not up to it, he won't do it. So I really think we're going to get this done. And I agree with you that with a snap of a finger, God can turn this around. Josiah, I really appreciate you coming on. Before you go, and you're welcome to come back because we got a lot more we could discuss. Before you go, please tell people about your Defining Truth nonprofit and where they can get your book and anything else you'd like to promote.
Absolutely. So we started Defining Truth, a nonprofit organization, as a sort of para-ministry organization to address everything that we've talked about today. So we speak, I travel and speak when given the opportunity. We run a podcast every Friday with my co-host, Brandon Jones. We put that out and we deal with current situations in the news and we talk about it from a biblical perspective. And I recently came out and finished my first book, which is Defining Truth. And each chapter is a culture war topic. And we go through it and we try to equip the reader with how to give a defense for Western civilization from a biblical worldview. It's a little deep, which I like because I want people to think deeply about these topics. But this is available on our website at definingtruth.org, definingtruth.org. You could buy a paperback like this. You can buy a Kindle version, and we just released an audio version for those who like to listen to it in the car when they drive. I do, and that's also available on our website.
Hey, you've been a busy man, and God has blessed you, and everything that you have done, just being in the military, the discipline, everything that you learned there, and the police and everything, it's all rolling into being used right now for God's work here, for now and eternity. God bless you, brother, your family, and thank you for coming on the show. As I said, you're always welcome to come back, and thank you for coming on and trying to get some people to understand it's now or never. We either go back to truth or we will go down. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
You're up, Mr. Josiah O'Neill. I want to thank Josiah O'Neill for his service and also for being a purveyor of truth. Boy, we really need this, people, because the wokesters and everybody on the left, they just want to get truth out because they want to create their own truth, and their own truth would lead to a communist United States. We're not going to have that. No way, no shape, no how. Not on our watch. So thank you for what you do, Josiah. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. The video version you can find at YouTube, Rumble, and Conservative Television of America. And please click that subscribe button so you'll get all the episodes automatically, and so it'll help other people find the show. Love it if you leave a rating and a review. We do have an audio version of the podcast archive where all the guests, 150 or more high-profile guests, that's where you'll find them. People like Kira Davis, Tom Del Vaccaro, Morgan Brittany, Ben Carson, Will Witt, Carol Swain, Monica Crowley. The list goes on and on. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. So give that a Dr. Carol Lieberman. She's on there, and Judge Janine Pirro. The names are just popping into my head. Just give it a listen. I'm sure you'll find somebody that you will like there. So that's it for now, everybody. Hope you enjoyed yourself. I know I did. So until the next time, this is your host, Gary Binford, saying God bless you, God bless your families, and God bless America.